Thank you for being here for the President's Faculty Lecture. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are privileged to be on the traditional unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam peoples, and I'd like to invite Gary George from SFU's Office of Aboriginal Peoples to come and bring some words of welcome. Gary.
As Andrew mentioned, my name is Gary George. I'm originally from north central British Columbia, from the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, and the closest towns are Smithers, Houston, and Burns Lake. Is there anybody here from Smithers or any of those areas? Small town up there, but it's beautiful country. And I am, as Andrew mentioned, we're like to start this event off in a good way and acknowledge that we are on traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people. And we'd like to offer thanks for allowing us to gather here today. And I'm going to actually drum a song, and it's a way to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And it's also a way to acknowledge all the different guests. So what I do is I go through and I usually, if it was at a feast or a potlatch, you would call out different First Nations. And the First Nations would stand up and they would usually just turn to the crowd like this. And that way you get to know where everybody else is from. But in this particular case, I might call out, I'll call out obviously Coast Salish. But I might call out just different cities or different countries, and try not to be shy. Just stand up, give a little wave. You might have seen this before, where elders will stand up and they'll go to the music, and they'll turn. And if you're standing towards that first half of the building, you can turn to the other people if you want. And it's a way to be proud of where you're from. And so take pride in where you're from, and don't be shy. But no pressure to. Thank you very much. And I just want to say I've been drumming since 1998. And one of the things about truth and reconciliation is recognizing the past. In some cases, our languages are almost gone. They're almost wiped out. But just wanted to mention that SFU has been taking steps. I'm not sure if many people know this, but they actually offer some languages, like they're actually teaching the Cree language and the Squamish language, and I'm making efforts to drum. And it's an honor to be asked to drum today. And although I can't speak my language fluently, I know some phrases, place names, that sort of thing. In our language, when we say touches our heart, we say Tana A. So Tana A for allowing me to come and be here today and do this welcoming and drum for you. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Heichka. And Gary reminds us that we are on a journey as a university and hopefully as a community in terms of trying to be instruments for reconciliation. And Gary, really appreciate your sharing your words and your drumming and welcome. So thank you so very much. Well, again, it's a really a pleasure for me to welcome you to this President's Faculty Lecture with Professor Jeff Redding on the topic that I must say is both exciting and a little intimidating for some of us who are non-scientists: Brave New World, Genomics, Big Data, AI, Precision Medicine, and the Future of Indigenous Community Engaged Research. So I'm sure you're looking forward to hear Jeff, and I am too. But let me just tell you a few things about this President's Faculty Lecture, because it's part of our commitment to be Canada's most community-engaged research university. And in pursuit of that goal, we think it's really important to share with the community some of the work, some of the ideas that are being generated by our faculty members and that we think are important not only within the university, but to the broader community. So this faculty lecture series is part of that commitment. It's embedded within a larger program called SFU Public Square, which hosts a community summit every year, hosts dialogues, workshops, most of which are open to the general public without charge. And I really encourage you to check the SFU Public Square website, where you can find other opportunities to become engaged with the university. And we view that engagement as beneficial to the university and to us as much as I hope it is to you. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about our speaker this evening, Dr. Jeff Redding. He's a member of the Mohawk Nation from Tainanaga in southern Ontario. He is a professor in SFU's Faculty of Health Sciences. He's First Nations Health Authority Chair in Heart Health and Wellness at St. Paul's Hospital. And he's also a member of the Board of Directors for Genome BC. So many talents and many facets to Jeff that he brings to this evening's talk. As an expert in Indigenous health, he's led several major research and education initiatives to improve the well-being of First Nations communities, not only in Canada, but around the world. When I was in Australia recently, they were talking about Jeff and some of the work he'd done there, and he tells me he's just been in New Zealand as well. So an international as well as a national scholar and contributor. He was founding director of the Centre for Aboriginal Health Research at the University of Victoria. He was inaugural scientific director of the CIHR Institute of Aboriginal Peoples. He was recipient of numerous awards, including a National Aboriginal Achievement Inspire Award, really one of the premier national awards, and one that I know we at SFU are really proud that Jeff is a holder of. In his current role as chair in Heart Health and Wellness, Jeff has established the first ever Indigenous Health Education Access Research and Training Center. And if you want to know the acronym, it's a wonderful acronym, iHeart, at Providence Health Research Institute. With the support of the BC and Yukon Heart and Stroke Foundation, iHeart is helping to inform the development and delivery of better health care for First Nations peoples. In addition to bringing attention to First Nations health issues, Jeff has played a pivotal role in the introduction of Canadian ethics guidelines for Indigenous health research. Really important if we are going to engage in research with Indigenous peoples, that we do it in a way that is respectful and that is ethical in Indigenous terms, as well as those that are brought to the equation by the university. So Jeff, very much a leader in that space as well. I'm just delighted that he has made time to share his knowledge and insights with us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Redding. Jeff.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Gary, for your welcoming to the territory and starting off our gathering in a good way, and to Andrew for your very kind words. That was very nice of you to acknowledge some of the things honored to do in the past, and hopefully we have some good work ahead of us. And all the people that came together to help me. I think Andrew, it's interesting being president of a university, I haven't shared my talk with him, so he's hoping, I suppose, that I say something that makes a little bit of sense and that doesn't embarrass the university too much. I'll try not to do that. But thank you all for coming. A beautiful fall day here in Vancouver. I know you're giving up time with your family and your friends, and I very much appreciate you coming out to hear this today. There's a lot here. I won't apologize for that. It's complex and complicated, but it's not that complicated that it's overly complex, if that makes any sense. What I want to try to do is make the complex simple, and not that simple that it waters down the content. So that's kind of an introduction to how this is going to go this evening. I would like to make the presentation and hold some time for comments and also questions so that we can have a discussion at the end. I have an astounding number of slides, which I think is a bit overboard, but I'll try to move through them fairly quickly, and I think I put them in there so that we could sort of explain the concepts that I'm trying to say. There's a lot here, and I felt that we really need to have a public dialogue about how fast science and technology is moving in this present age, and the intersection of all this, and how do we acknowledge different ways of knowing. So we'll go through that piece by piece. I do want to acknowledge the people who support my chair and the institutions. The heart with the slash, that is the Heart and Stroke logo, in case you were wondering, and they're generous supporting the chair at the First Nations Health Authority, identified there. Providence Health Foundation contributed to the chair, as it's based at Simon Fraser University in the Faculty of Health Sciences. I wanted to, again, acknowledge the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people and the various First Nations. And it's not only the place where the 3 campuses of SFU are located, but it's also the place that we are privileged to work, live, and play in the Lower Mainland here. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. It's a number of concepts and a bit like a storyline or a narrative, and I kind of want to weave them together. And any discussion about Indigenous health has to talk about colonization, the political, social, and economic history of Canada, if you will. We want to talk about, as the title indicates, a brave new world, adapting to this revolutionary growth and knowledge creation that we're all experiencing. The social, legal, and ethical issues that go along with that, which I would say need attention, and we need to touch on that as well. We do need to talk about Indigenous truth and reconciliation, which I consider as the unfinished business of Canadian Confederation, and we'll go into some detail there. Again, looking at good models of how we move forward together, the First Nations Health Authority and the focus of First Nations people leading work for First Nations people and by First Nations people with the support of allies is really what that's all about. Nothing about us without us. And I've been around long enough to know that there was a time not too long ago when things were done by well-meaning people who had never had any direct knowledge of the communities and their dynamics. And finally, I wanted to end off with this notion of embracing diversity, and the idea that through embracing diversity, we are stronger as a civil society. And that diversity includes Indigenous ways of knowing, which are ancient and unique worldviews that I think are complementary, and I think we'll give some examples of how that works, not just in Canadian context, but also from a researcher in China. So the first slide here talks about, first of all, maps our ideology. If we think about ideology and the idea that European forces could go ahead and possess lands by laying claim to those lands, that's clearly reflected in this map, which is from the 1700s. And in the legend in the bottom, it says British possessions, French, Spanish possessions, Portuguese, and Dutch possessions. And you can see here in this West Indies, even the name West Indies is derived from the Western Indies opposed to the Eastern Indies. And they basically split up the islands among the British, the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish. So they basically laid claim to these territories as a result of colonization. And I mean, that's a matter of history. So the question becomes, how did this impact the indigenous people who were living in those lands? And I think the idea was to have forced assimilation so that they could make way for the political state of Canada and other nations around the world. The problem with that is, and this is pointed out by a Nobel Prize winner who happened to be a biomedical scientist, and he pointed out every disease has two causes, physiological and political. I would actually say he's right, first of all, but the order might be wrong. Maybe political in the context of Indigenous was more important than the physiological that followed. And a lot of people look at illness in the Indigenous community and look at some kind of weakness or some kind of deficiency. And I would suggest that this is a really important concept that we need to think about, is that we need to ask ourselves and question, how did the health status of Indigenous people come to be? At around the same time, the public health in Europe and parts of North America was pretty deplorable. As you can see, these kids don't seem to have any problem sitting next to a rotting horse, and that building just on the side there is a dairy, which also. So the idea that you could transmit infectious diseases and they would be causing illness was not recognized. It was through biomedical research, and I just want to say that science has an important role to play in improving the health and well-being of people in Canada and all around the world. But it needs to be done with the conscious involvement of the people who is intended to be. In this case, different measures were implemented through public health that started to create policies, and those policies in turn improve the health and well-being of billions of people. So the historic health of Indigenous people, and this was taken from Michael Dan, who's a neurosurgeon philanthropist at the University of Toronto. And he made a couple of interesting points here in his slide that he made at SFU last year. First, that at the time of contact, the First Nations people on the prairies were among the tallest people in the world. And that was probably due to better nutrition and good exercise. Abraham Maslow, who was, as you recall, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, who lived in New York City, went out to the Canadian prairies and actually studied the Blackfoot community in 1938, and he concluded that they're more emotionally stable than 90% of the settler control group that he had studied. And of course, a lot of diseases that were brought to Turtle Island being North America, there's a long list of diseases that had the result of, in some cases, completely eliminating the Indigenous community, and in other cases, 75 to 95% of the population was decimated by these diseases because there was no inherent immunity. They had never been exposed to these organisms, the viruses and the bacteria. So it's important to recognize that even though there are challenges in the health of Indigenous people, people are resilient, that they actually came through this sort of huge challenge to the health and well-being at the individual level and at the community level. So it raises the issue about reconciliation. First there was infectious diseases, and then there were socially derived problems associated with, as we know, the residential schools and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I wanted to just go over a little quote here from our first Prime Minister. It says, Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training in residential schools, industrial schools, where they will acquire the habits and modes and thoughts of white men. Not white women, white men. And so that's important. That was a quote that was made in the Canadian House of Commons. And it was pretty much mainstream thinking that this was for the benefit of savages, that they had to be forcibly assimilated into the mainstream for their benefit. Canada, as a nation state not too far from here, was moving rapidly to improve the political economy, and that made sense by having the Canadian National Railway link, and it was in southern BC. And of course, in this image, it's a great shot of Canadian history, but there's no Indigenous people that I can see that are in that image. It's important to recognize that a lot of the issues and opportunities that had to be addressed to get to this point were done in partnership with Indigenous people. For example, my own community, a Mohawk community in southern Ontario, my ancestors had played a role in the War of 1812 and the American Revolution, and really were responsible in part for drawing the lines of boundaries between Canada and the United States. And that's why you have Mohawk communities in the United States and also in Canada and Quebec, because our leaders were captains in the British Army. We ended up being based in Canada, where our traditional territory is in the United States. So it's important to recognize that there is a history and there was treaty making that happened, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So if we move forward with colonization ideological maps to 1919, you can see that colonization has expanded to almost all parts of the world. And these charts, again, at the bottom are interesting. Areas of the world's empires. So they're saying in the case of Great Britain or the United Kingdom, which is the big pink square, the little scribble in the middle is actually a map of Great Britain, and the pink box is the land in relation to their own land base that was part of the Commonwealth. And similarly with the population sizes, you can see the British guy wearing the top hat here, and then the person from India in terms of population. So this is a graphic representation of how a minority population can actually go out there and control vast parts of the world. And it was a real bonanza. I mean, can you imagine discovering a planet that was rich and bountiful in all kinds of resources, and your own planet was actually not that healthy? So every population that had the means in Europe spread out this way, and that's fine. What happened in this country, and we're all aware of this, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has documented through the stories of the people who experienced this, and it wasn't that long ago, that it was what the New York Times and other papers called a sort of cultural genocide. And I think that's being kind if you look at some of the stories that occurred. It was forced assimilation, as I said before, and there were winners and losers in that battle. Now, I don't want to give the impression that everybody in Canada was against the Native people in Canada. This was a person here, Peter Bryce, who basically started the Public Health Agency in Ontario and is a medical officer for the Department of Indian Affairs. And he wrote a book which was called The Story of a National Crime. And what it was documenting was the number of children who were in residential schools, Native residential schools, where they had been, died or were sick with tuberculosis. And it wasn't a treatable condition, but they did know that there were environmental things that could be done that would mitigate the loss. And he actually lost his job because he basically was doing statistics on documenting the number of children, and they cut his funding, saying that the cost of gathering statistics on child death far outweighed the benefit of the information provided, which to me is kind of like, if that's not a statement about genocide, I don't know what is. The cost of acquiring statistics is outweighed by the benefit of, so it's like, forget about it, we're not going to be doing anything about it, so why would you want to count it? Now, it's important that we kind of recognize this in the context of legal obligations by the Crown. Again, in my own community, The Simcoe Letters formed the basis of a treaty, and that treaty is acknowledged by the Queen Anne Silver, which to this day is still held within the community. That was in the 1700s, 100 years before Canada became a nation state. So treaties, unlike in the United States and other part of the world, were legal contracts that were agreed to between the Crown in England and also the Government of Canada. Treaties aren't a historical artifact. They're still being negotiated and signed to this day. And they're about mutual coexistence between friends. I could give a whole other lecture about that, but that's the first part of the lecture here. I was just giving everybody up to speed on the context, the sort of Indigenous Issues 101. Now we want to talk a little bit about this Brave New World idea back in 1932. Everybody put up their hand if they've ever read this book. Yeah, so most people have back in high school or earlier. And it was, this dystopian society. It was London, and it had to do with, they contrasted it to the savage people who lived a random kind of life. And I thought it was a good take on our current situation, because it was written some time ago, but we're starting to actually see that some of these things are coming to truth. As a matter of fact, one of the things that they talked about was that embryos would be created, and they would be designer babies as a result of manipulating the genetic predisposition. And it turns out that last month in Ottawa, at the law faculty, there was an ethics discussion called Designer Babies, Why Let the Stork Decide? And it has to do with the idea that you could look at different kinds of factors that you could manipulate in the predispositions by looking at the genetic and the biological material. And so people are starting to rally around, like these technologies are starting to, they're converging, and what they said in the 1930s has relevance and currency today. It's important that these discussions take place in terms of reproductive technology. Around that same time in the 1930s, there was this renaissance of science and medicine, and the idea that hospitals could provide the kind of health care that was needed to extend and make lives better. So the Grey Nuns established hospitals all across the country, and one of them was here in Vancouver, St. Paul's Hospital in the 1930s. It turns out that that hospital now, if there was a major earthquake, most of it wouldn't be standing, and so the asset of a hospital and all the expertise and equipment contained in there would become a liability in the case of a major earthquake, which they're predicting is going to happen at some point. So of course there's this big movement to construct a new hospital. And that's why I think it's really important that we have these kinds of discussions now, because we can actually reimagine what a new healthcare facility would look like and how it would reach out to populations who might be marginalized. And we don't have to walk too far from here to find certain populations marginalized in the city. So we need to think seriously about making some fundamental changes in how the healthcare system can support those changes. There is a fair bit of mistrust within the Native community. In Port Alberni and all across the north, there were studies conducted on nutrition. This was reported by Ian Mosby, who's a non-Native scholar at Guelph University and an ally, a person who went into the historical records and pulled out these documents looking at these studies. What they were trying to do was look at the efficacy of minerals and vitamins in development at the time, 1940s. And so these kids were basically starved and fed vitamins, and then they could measure their physiological changes associated with the supplements themselves, to try and figure out if they would be safe or useful. It was, so again, these experiments have been well documented, and survivors recall being hungry all the time. There have been other trials like this in the States and other parts of the world where there was no informed consent, that the parents weren't notified. These kids were first of all taken away from their parents without their parents' consent, and then exposed to these experiments. So this is just one example of many where, communities, First Nations people, Inuit people, there's a lot of stories out there about how they are legitimately mistrusting of mainstream society. So that's a real problem that we can solve. I wanted to, because I was born in 1956, I'm pretty old. I grew up in an era where, there was this notion that we could take care of, the less well off. And, there's Nehru there, who was the sort of first prime minister of India and who was, quote unquote, a freedom fighter and really started to move forward when India gained independence. And of course, President John F. Kennedy. But the tall guy is an economist. His name is John Kenneth Galbraith. He's actually a Harvard professor. He's passed away now. He grew up in very humble beginnings in southwestern Ontario and on a farm. And he was a primary advisor to 6 presidents of the United States through the late 1950s and early 1960s and beyond. And Galbraith wrote a book in 1958 which he wanted to call Why the Poor Are Poor. And nothing like that had ever been written before. And his wife said, that's not a very good title because nobody's going to read a book called Why the Poor Are Poor. So he changed the title to The Affluent Society, which I thought was kind of funny. And it was a book, and it's still worth reading. A lot of, dated things, but here's some of the things that came out, the take-home messages, what I thought are important. It said, management of the modern economy by the affluent, for the affluent, will fail. It said that affluence has the effect of comfortable disregard for those excluded from its benefits and its culture. I think it's highly relevant to the circumstances going on in this country, but also abroad. The policy actions in order to address disparities across the populations in a civil society, movements towards social inclusion, not exclusion, focusing on investing in human development, investing conditional cash transfers to support households, to decrease poverty, improvements of health and education, to raise the standard for populations and communities, to have a policy and a program that was inclusive growth, integrating the poor into fast-growing economies, and finally guaranteeing minimum incomes so that people could imagine a future for themselves and their family beyond their certain circumstances that they found themselves in. So what happens when I was in graduate school at the University of Toronto in 1993, I finished, and Oka was a little town in south of Montreal, or just east of Montreal here, and there was the Oka crisis and Ganasatake, and it was a conflict between the military and the Mohawks in southern Quebec, and the community of Ganawage, which is down on the south shore of Montreal, sort of aligned with Ganasatake, and they basically started this summer of military action with a lot of helicopters. This is actually a video that was done as a documentary about that. And I think that was a turning point in Canadian history, certainly in Indigenous history. And of course, as an academic, what do? We write a paper about it. So Charlotte Lope and John O'Neill, the former dean at Faculty of Health Sciences, and I wrote a report talking about the Royal Commission. Now, it was out of the Oka crisis that the Royal Commission was started. And the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples had all sorts of recommendations about improving health and well-being. 20 years later, the Truth and Reconciliation completed its deliberations, and it came out with what looked like very similar policy directives to improve the health and well-being and life of Indigenous people in the country. So we were raising the question, are we going to have another commission report 20 years from now that's going to essentially say the same thing? When are we going to start to make some difference? And of course, then of course along came Trudeau, and the second Trudeau, Justin Trudeau. Now I'm not saying he's perfect, but I think we're not going to talk about his predecessor, that's ancient history. But Justin came out with his mandate statements here. No relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. It's a time for a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. It's taken a long time to hear a prime minister say that in this country. And so it's sort of kick-started this reconciliation agenda. There was a meeting here in Vancouver of the Physicians Association of Canada, the Canadian Medical Association at their general meeting, and Alika Fontaine, who's president of Indigenous Physicians, said, he was talking about reconciliation, and he really was talking about the relationship of Canadians to Indigenous people. And he says here, it's not just about empowerment of First Nations and First Nation patients, it's about empowerment of you, meaning, in that case, the physicians of Canada, to be better allies and to find your place in the Canadian fabric that doesn't exclude Indigenous people. So it's really shifting the conversation away from what Indigenous people need to do to reconcile the situation to what Canada needs to do to reconcile the situation of Indigenous people. In other words, we all have a role to play about moving that agenda forward as a unified nation state. So, you know, we've come a long way from our first Prime Minister and his idea of forced assimilation for the benefit of savages to one that's more of an inclusive, which I would suggest is in relation to what John Kenneth Galbraith was saying about trying to imagine a society that's more free of discrimination, has equal opportunity and fairness for everyone. So I just want to switch now into some of the science that we're going to talk about, because a lot of this is background information, and I apologize for some of you that have heard this stuff before. This is me when I was doing my doctorate in the nuclear cardiology lab at the Toronto Hospital. I'm the one taking the blood, not the one on the machine. And yeah, that was a turning point for me. I came from the inner city in Toronto, and I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to study in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. I also was extremely fortunate to have the opportunity in 2000 to be one of the first of the cohort of scientific directors at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And Alan Bernstein in the center there, he's a mathematician who was one of Canada's leading cancer researchers and ended up being the leader of this new Canadian Institutes of Health Research. An absolutely brilliant man. And not just because he hired me, but he pulled together a group of people who we really worked together well, despite the fact that we were from different backgrounds. And of course, it had different kinds of institutes. There were about 40 different proposals for institutes that went forward as papers, and 13 survived and the review process. And so about 10 or 11 of them were sort of population-based or disease or body part-based institutes. There was one right next to me, Miriam Stewart, Gender and Health, the only institute for health research at the national level anywhere in the world that entirely focused on gender and health, and then Indigenous peoples. So, we talk a bit about science here. This is, you got a femur for a 57 Caucasian. The idea here is that stem cells can be somehow magically injected into a body, and it can grow organs or it can grow body parts, where they're not existing. And there's some truth to that, but there's a lot of media hype and miscommunication when it comes to this. And a lot of the things, given the fact that I've, grew up in the 50s and 60s, I just wanted to reflect on some of the things that happened. Like there was this, the fantastic Voyage, that movie in 1966, where people were shrunk down and put into a hypodermic needle and injected into the body to save a brain cancer or whatever it was. And they were going through the organs, and it was completely off the walls. It was just so fantastic. And yet, we're actually doing stuff like that right now with regenerative medicine and nanotechnologies. We're actually targeting tumors and the delivery of therapeutic drugs towards patients and to remove and to target therapies towards patient needs. Again, right now I was in the Apple store and I was asking about the ECG that allows you to get a cardiac rhythm from, normally you can get a watch that can give you your heart rate, but you can't actually see the rhythm, and this is actually coming out. They tell me that these watches are all programmed to give a cardiac rhythm by looking at your watch, by touching the watch itself, but they're not being regulated yet. They're waiting for the Canadian government to give them the okay, and then they'll electronically switch all these watches on. This is a really important thing because, for example, if you're a nurse living in a northern remote community, or if you're working in sub-Saharan Africa or a lower middle-income country, and you don't have access to care, and somebody comes into your healthcare facility, and you need to have a portable strip to see what's going on. Are they having a serious life-threatening arrhythmia, or is it something that can be treated and just, over time? And it's really important, potentially life-saving intervention. And I'm not a cardiologist, I'm just showing you that this is one example of technology that's moving so rapidly. Here's another example. Now, monitoring your blood pressure is extremely important when you have a chronic illness. Now, this is a piece of technology which can be placed on anywhere in your body to give accurate readings of your blood pressure. It works better if it's stuck on your neck, but it's really an important factor because, when you monitor blood pressure normally, you have to have a cuff, you have to have, you have to listen for the heartbeat through a stethoscope, and you have to be trained to interpret those signals. This can actually be downloaded. This stent can, 24/7 monitor blood pressure. So if you're a patient that has an arrhythmia, like the previous slide, and your blood pressure is dropping at the same time, you're starting to combine these things. So you're looking at things where you can combine vital signs with diagnosis of disease, which actually could be very useful in different settings. Here we're talking about, this is, I apologize for this wordy slide, but it's essentially looking at what they call diabetic retinopathy, which is when a person has diabetes and it's uncontrolled, the sugar in your blood can actually damage your retina or your vision. And these pictures that could be taken by non-medical staff could be interpreted through something called an algorithm. And these algorithms, it basically shows here, this is comparing the algorithm of interpreted by the technology to the same thing interpreted by radiologists. And it's showing that a high degree of agreement between the algorithm by the machine technology versus the human technology. Now, it's not replacing the physician at all. It's actually freeing the physician to focus their time on the more complicated cases. But when we're looking at a healthcare system that's under a lot of financial pressure, and looking at technologies that can, this is just one example. So these algorithms that allow physicians to make decisions more rapidly by providing the background information about what's happening there, it's very useful, and it can be extremely useful in a healthcare setting. But we have to look at these technologies with caution. Now, if we're talking about cars that drive themselves, or robots that come into our homes and fix things for us, that's all artificial intelligence. And I think artificial intelligence is actually not a great word. It's not intelligent, but it does analyze large amounts of data, and it allows you to make the right decision at the right time. And that is a very useful tool. Of course, any conversation about technologies wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about Star Trek. And this is what's called the tricorder, which was in Star Trek. And the Star Trek tricorder was this gadget where the physician would put it in front of a patient, and the patient would just not have to do anything, and he would come up with a diagnosis and the vital signs. Well, it turns out that a company that's interested in invention and innovation sponsored a $10 million contest to see which group could come up. And this was, there were hundreds of groups around the world. It narrowed down to about 10 different groups from all around the world, Japan and Europe and the United States. And so this is the first prize out of the $10 million. And basically, they produced a machine that you could hold in your hand that would take about 10 different vital signs and diagnose 3 or 4 diseases. And it was reviewed by a panel of medicine specialists. So it's kind of surreal in a way that all this is happening, and each one of these things would be seen as an incredible breakthrough. And a lot of these things are works in progress, but you start to think about, well, it's all kind of happening, and what happens as it starts to intersect, and one sort of improves the other. And I think that's where artificial intelligence comes into play, because it allows biotechnology and computer technology to work together so that you can actually look at making better decisions and saving the healthcare system more money. So this is an example. This was in the U of T magazine recently. This machine, which could be put on the desktop, that could analyze, a physician in the office could actually take a sample and determine whether the person had a virus or a bacteria, which is an important thing to know, because if you give someone an antibiotic for a virus, it's probably not going to be very useful. So that's a very useful tool. So there's a lot of these technologies. Again, another review of artificial intelligence made this statement in there, and I just want to look at this. It says, how do we avoid machine bias? And that's what's one of the topics around. It's only the decisions that come out of genomics and the artificial intelligence and the precision medicine is only as good as the information that goes in. It says, algorithms carry as much risk of bias as any human. Search the CEO in an image search engine, for example, and your computer will return mainly pictures of white men. Algorithms tend to amplify the built-in sexism and racism of training data. So the algorithm is only as good as what goes in. In the health sphere, algorithmic bias could mean the machine recommends the wrong treatment for groups that have historically been marginalized from health research. So that's an important observation, right? If we're going to rely on technology to make decisions about life-threatening issues. There's a paper that came out in Nature a few years ago that talked about the persistent bias, how the genomics is failing on diversity, and these it shows that 90% of what we know about the human genome there back in 2009 was based on European white males, and that has changed up until 2018, where there's been more investment by Asia in terms of sequencing the genome. And so it's really important, because I'll show you in a moment why it's important. But the technology and the sequencing the cost of doing that has come down tremendously. This I pulled off out of a report that came out a couple of weeks ago, January 2017. This company is doing its best to sequence whole genomes for $100. I'll just remind you that in 2003, the cost of the human genome was $2.7 billion. So imagine that you could sequence an individual genome for less than $100. That would provide a huge amount of diagnostic information, right? So here's an example of that. This is Laura Arbour and Nadine Caron. Some of you might know them. Nadine's a surgeon who works up in Prince George, and Laura is a geneticist and a pediatrician who works out of UBC but lives in Victoria and runs the Island Genetics Program. And we have been involved in a project funded by Genome Canada that's looking at addressing undiagnosed genetic diseases among Indigenous children all across Canada. And that is an important study because it involves addressing unmet needs of children, but an equally important part of that is that it's entering into this realm of accessing genetic information to improve the health and well-being. And that, I can tell you, is a very contentious issue, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But this is basically the overview of the study itself. And it's important to recognize that activity 1 is about governance. It's about governance and capacity building in the community, and that's the most important prerequisite for engaging in Indigenous communities around the acquisition of biological materials for research and for treatment and care. And the other aspects of the study are precision diagnosis of children with genetic diseases so that you could actually make a diagnosis. What happens now is that people never get diagnosed because they don't see a genetic counselor or a geneticist, and so they live with these conditions which could be treated. Activity 3 is to build that background variant library, which I was talking about. You know, when you have 96% of all that we know about genomics in addressing a certain population, you need to build the background variant library for minority populations, and that's what this study will do. And the last part is looking at the economics of diagnosis in the population, which is a requirement, and I think an important one from Genome Canada and Genome BC. So this is the team that's reaching out to communities, and you know, the First Nations Health Authority, the Assembly of First Nations, the Métis Council, the Inuit Council, Native Women in Canada, we're all partners in this landmark kind of study. So there's a lot of engagement and a lot of trust that this study will do some good, you know, on the context of past behaviors when people didn't really feel that their needs were being met. So there's a lot here, and I'm just going to go through the next few really quickly because I'm a heart health chair, so I have to talk a little bit about heart health here. But there are different kinds of research that we would imagine, you know, quantitative research, clinical guidelines, concordance, the ability to look at are the guidelines being addressed and met in Native communities, looking at engagement of patients in the clinical decision making, and also looking at qualitative issues around the patient experience, like what happens when you go to a clinic or a hospital, what is experienced and what is the multidimensional lived experience in the context of trust and cultural safety. So we have doctoral students at SFU who are looking at these. One, Krista Stelkaya, who works at the First Nations Health Authority and is doing her PhD, looking at racism and cultural safety within the healthcare system and trying to unravel some of the concerns on both sides of that question. So there's a lot of study design issues that we get confronted with, and as a former scientific director of CHR, we fund research. We don't necessarily fund methods and tools. And a lot of the methods and tools in Aboriginal health or Indigenous health were observational studies, looking at, well, you know, Native people are 6 times more likely to commit suicide than non-Native people, or Native people have this at a higher rate than that. So that's kind of the deficit model, and it isn't all that helpful in trying to move forward to improve health. What the community has said to us in fairly loud voice is that they want intervention studies. They want to do studies that actually test something that's going to be useful to the community, show that it's useful, and then scale it up to large populations. Again, the cardiovascular system is an example of that. The coronaries are tiny little arteries around our hearts that provide the pump with the oxygen that it needs. And of course, when they get blocked, they can be opened, and that's through something called coronary angioplasty. So here's a picture of an artery that's blocked either with a thrombosis, like a blood clot, or through just a narrowing of the lumen of that coronary. And this is what happens after it's revascularized. Think of it as gaining back real estate, you know, before you've had a major heart attack. If that wasn't open again, this whole bottom section of the heart itself would die, i.e. a heart attack, and the person also might die. So, you know, there was a study done in Alberta that looked at access to care for First Nations around once they were diagnosed of having a heart attack and brought into the hospital. And what this study concluded was once you hit the hospital, there was no difference in the way we're treated, which is good. That's a great outcome. But it did show that there was quite a disparity in who actually made it to the hospital door. So that's an important is an important result. So we need to focus not what happens so much in the hospital, although it's still important. We need to actually focus our efforts on what's going on in the community. How can we get early identification, rapid transportation? So we're involved in a bunch of studies, at St. Paul's, where we're interested in looking at improving diagnosis and early treatment with a professor at UBC named Jim Christensen, some of you may know, who's an emergency room physician. Again, there's a lot of cardiovascular issues that are important to consider, which are in part due to genetics and also in part due to environmental influences. And of course, the fetal circulation during pregnancy, where the infant is entirely dependent on the mother, is critical, especially the first trimester, in terms of cardiovascular development. So there's a lot of potential that we could do here in terms of optimizing health and delivery. And wrote a paper not too long ago in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology about the potential opportunities to improve the health and well-being of Indigenous people in the area of cardiovascular. So a title that says improving potential opportunities doesn't sound as important as confronting the growing crisis. So that's the title I went with. But it is an important aspect, and it's important to think about. Now, as one person or with my colleagues, it's not that easy to kind of have a system-wide impact. So essentially, we'll talk a little bit about the iHeart Center. The idea there is to try and reach out to get allies to be engaged in this struggle to improve health. One thing that's important in terms of models is the First Nations Health Authority, and this is kind of one of the logos that they kind of live by. Nothing about us without us. So they want to be engaged in every aspect of healthcare delivery that involves Indigenous communities. And it was it didn't happen overnight. It was a long struggle to move forward to what is basically a tripart relationship over the administration of healthcare services in this province. And something, we're not perfect, but there's no other else on this planet that is doing this kind of innovative work, that they've taken a whole region, like a whole entire province, and they've negotiated with the federal and provincial authorities to manage healthcare system under First Nations control. It's a model for the province, it's a model for the country, and it's a model for the world, and it's being looked at. And actually, they're doing a pretty good job, I think. It achieved consensus, and there's a lot of different principles that flow out of this health authority. One of them has to do with what they call, this is Joe Gallagher and the senior management team over there, and all the people that work at the health authority, looking at reciprocal accountability. The idea that our accountability needs to be reciprocal, back and forth between our communities and what the institution is doing for the communities as well, and what different levels of government. So when they negotiate with Providence Health or Simon Fraser, these principles of reciprocal accountability are part of the governance process. Again, they have a different focus on the healthcare administration system that's more community focused and goes up to the decision makers rather than sort of senior CEO focused and trickle down to the communities. There's a lot of potential to look at issues, that long-standing issues about mistrust within the healthcare system and embracing a culturally humility in healthcare service provision. Now I just want to switch again here, and I know I'm switching around quite a bit, but I'm trying to kind of tell a story here so that when we start to get towards the end, we start to see that there's opportunity to make positive change. So back in 2006, there was a study that was done to look at the DNA of tribes in Alaska, and it was called the moonshot of genetics within Indigenous populations, but it basically came to a halt when the communities refused to participate. Around that same time, Laura Arbour, the person that I showed you a picture of with Nadine Caron, who got this Silent Genomes project, she published a paper with Doris Cook talking about what was negotiated with the New Chavnith Tribal Council on Vancouver Island, this notion of DNA on loan. New Chalmouth had a bad experience with the use of DNA for other purposes for which it was intended. And that was reconciled. But this concept of DNA alone, so that if biological samples were collected, they could only be used for the stated purpose that was agreed to, and any other additional use or secondary use of that data had to go back and be renegotiated with the original participants. So that was an important collaboration, not only between UBC and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, but it was also between the New Chalmouth people who informed that. Again, that led to work that articulated Indigenous guidelines for health research that were part of the CHR. This is all the same document with different artwork, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations. And you can see the syllabics there in the Inuit document. And so they're explaining, and it's a detailed document that's no longer policy because it was replaced by this document, which is the Tri-Council Policy Statement for Ethics involving Indigenous people. And this chapter, which specifically focuses on Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And they wouldn't have its own chapter if it wasn't significantly different than the rest of the document. So if you're interested in doing research with Indigenous people, this is like essential reading to get to the point of ethics review. Now, some people will see this as building ethical walls around Native communities. I would suggest that it's the opposite, and it was always intended to be an enabling thing, to create a set of conditions that would be acceptable to communities so that people could be engaged in meaningful dialogue and research. So we're in this era of big data, big information. You know, some people want to go to Silicon Valley and be the next Bill Gates. Well, there's a lot of people crowding that space. But there's a lot of people analyzing data, and there's a lot of money going into this to focus on, you know, looking at how data can be actually compiled, and we'll talk about that in a moment. This is Gwen Phillips, who's this visionary board member of the First Nations Health Authority, and this is a quote from her: "Data governance is a foundation of nation rebuilding. Our leaders work hard to promote positive change, and they need access to data to show how well their community is doing in areas such as health and education. When decisions have good data, we make good decisions. We can build sound plans, and we can make good investments, and this is good governance." And that's coming from the leaders in the First Nations Health Authority. So again, you know, we stimulate these meetings and we talk about how can Canada and the United States move forward with priorities on population health genetics. I just wanted to show this quick slide here, just to show that with data and research, you've got good knowledge translation, bad translation, good research evidence, and bad. And you know, what you really want is good research evidence and having that translating into policy. What you don't want is bad research evidence with good translation into policy. And some people would argue that that's what's happened in a lot of Native communities. Again, you don't want bad evidence and bad knowledge translation, but that's not as bad as the other because it's not being translated well. And of course, good evidence that's suboptimal in its knowledge translation is also not good. And it's important to reflect on this because research by itself doesn't change anything. It's the actual good evidence production, good science, married with good translation of that evidence into action. And here's a perfect example. If we look at this slide, and we're looking at, this is HIV age standardized rates from the Provincial Medical Officer's report. And these are the years along here comparing status Indians to the general population. And that solid line there shows, or the dotted line shows, you can see the break in the line and the drop in mortality. That's when antiretrovirals came on the scene. And so this was a life-saving cocktail of medications a person could take if they were HIV positive that would literally save their life. What happened with the solid line, which is the status Indian line, is that it was having no impact whatsoever. The antiretroviral drugs were not being taken for whatever reason. So this is good research. It's a bad outcome because people are dying, but it's saying that we have to do something in this space to improve that. So the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network and other groups have looked at this and have looked at how to engage patients, Indigenous patients, to try and understand why a person wouldn't take a life-saving medication cocktail. It's really important to unpack this a little bit, and this was a report that was done some time ago looking at science in general, and it looked at the paradigms in science and how something becomes normal and something is revolutionary. And the evolution of scientific theory, it doesn't emerge from the straightforward accumulation of fact. It's about changing intellectual circumstances and possibilities. It's really about, you can look at different aspects of science addressing the same topic and often come out of it with contradictory statements about the same thing. And, unfortunately, that's not the way scientists think. A lot of scientists think that their answer is the answer and other answers don't really matter. A good example of that has to do with diabetes in the native population. And there was this idea that diabetes was part of the thrifty gene hypothesis, which was never proven. And the diabetes, because hunter-gatherers would save and store fat biologically in anticipation of the famine, that would be an evolutionary benefit. And so that would predispose someone to be diabetic or obese when there was no famine. And that was, so there was a lot of research to try and prove this hypothesis, but it was never proven. So theory to knowledge to action on the basis of a hypothesis is not science. You actually have to have the evidence, and it has to be clear. But people still think this way. And it's important. We actually wrote this paper in the Globe and Mail, and we talked about what was called the postmortem on the thrifty gene hypothesis, and it generated a record number of responses, for a health-related. And I really like these responses. There was 182 comments generated in a 24-hour period. I just want to read these because one says, the article names no one person as racist, and maybe that's the wrong term to use, but it does make clear that science is value-based and trapped in its own historical and cultural context, like every other type of knowledge. Interesting. The second one, it says, I believe the word prejudice is used correctly in this article headline, but misunderstood by some readers. Prejudice doesn't only mean being biased against a group of people, it also means a predisposition to believe something because you want it to be true or because it's a convenient truth. And the final one here is, this article impresses with the extent of ostensibly objective scientists, and their research can be constrained and limited by their own misguided orthodoxy, and how their perspectives are increasingly rooted in isolated specialization rather than integration. We would do well to be wary of such myopic outlooks. It's kind of interesting when you put complex ideas out to the public, and people come back with these kinds of responses. Like, these people have thought about this, and they have pretty good ideas, and it's a kind of a reality check for scientists to kind of ease off a little bit and say, okay, maybe I start to reach out there and talk about the other disciplines. The SSHRC is leading this, social sciences and humanities, is leading this call for concept papers about how to link CIHR, SSHRC, and the National Science and Engineering Research Council together to talk about interdisciplinary research. And I think the timing is really good because we can learn a lot from embracing diversity, different ways of knowing, different thought processes, and also embracing ancient ways of knowing. Now, this is a really good example. Artemisinin is a drug that was an ancient herb derived from a plant that is currently being used to treat malaria. And the story of this was really interesting because this woman, her name is Professor Yubu Tu in China, was interested in ancient Chinese medicine. And it turns out that ancient Chinese medicine took careful records all the way back to over 1000 BC. So 3,000 years of careful documenting of all kinds of, and she went through hundreds and hundreds of documents. And these are just examples. And you could look at the timelines of these documents that she was able to look at and review to try and connect the plant to how traditional medicine had treated malaria. And so she came out, and being in the pharmaceutical sciences, like the Western-based trained she isolated this this plant into a medication that was really effective at treating malaria. And she won the Nobel Prize for her work. And that was in 2015. And if you want, you can look on the internet and catch her whole Stockholm address. Now, it's an important study for a number of reasons. There's a lot of knowledge that's not in the Western paradigm that's been documented in other traditional ways of knowing in terms of different traditions around scientific, research. And it would be foolish not to take advantage of that. I put this up here. If I could have shown a similar slide about how Indigenous knowledge had informed Western practice, I would. And I think it's really an untapped area of science if we can actually embrace some of the teachings and learnings in traditional medicine. So we're in this area here. Again, in China, this is just one example of the kinds of research centers that they're putting together, looking at biological measures, right from the atom right through to ecosystems. So you're going from the molecular basis to tissues and organs to actual ecosystems entirely. And they're trying to kind of pull all this information under one roof. It's important, and it's happening, and it's something that we need to be aware of. So in the context of what we do, we're in our small little way trying to integrate a university with a First Nations health authority, a charitable leading organization, a foundation, and Providence Foundation, and St. Paul's Cardiology. And so each one of those areas has got a lot of firepower in terms of intellectual capabilities. But you're basically linking discovery or research with treatment and care, with advocacy, population-patient advocacy. And it's in the intersection of these areas that really exciting things start to happen. So this is kind of what Rebecca Lee, who is the manager of the iHeart Center, we've been working on this for the last couple of years. And so this is just an example of how we try to kind of engage in this space between these large organizations, the foundations, the hospital, the university, so that we can actually be the kind of engagement piece that we can allow people like Jim Christensen to look at Native communities, to look at Pat Camp, who's a respiratory physio researcher at St. Paul's, to look at respiratory issues. Kelly Lee looking at tobacco and global health, and a whole list of people. So I've been there, done that, being the head of a research center and making sure that I ran and controlled everything. But this is a different thing. This is more like reconciliation. This is more like saying, okay, we can be the catalyst to try to help other people own this issue and improve health. So the target, I just came up with this. It's about trying to put under one roof what I call seamless data analysis, where you've actually got bioinformatics, you've got information, you've got technology and expertise to look at algorithm development, and all this requires investment. You have to look at different research trials and translate that research into evidence and keep this moving. It requires large investments in biobanks and technology. Again, this is the life path, and what we're trying to do here is to optimize human development. We're trying to look at upstream forces, address policy issues around eradicating poverty, but at the same time, looking at where we can intervene along that life course, and looking at the healthcare system and how the system is responsive to the needs of vulnerable populations. So while this is about Indigenous health, I think there's lots of populations that could relate to this. What really matters is this interaction of determinants in the Indigenous context over this entire life course. So there's things that you can do specifically timed at a person's growth and development stage that will make a difference in altering that trajectory to improve health and well-being. And we used to say that genetic endowment and biology were untouchable. Well, it turns out that that's not really true, that there's a lot of research going on that is allowing us to intervene at the cellular and molecular level that will improve patient outcomes and prevent illness. But we're all still struck with this notion of structural racism that exists within the healthcare system, and that's an issue that needs social scientists to look at. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was getting us on a page where we started to blur the lines between the social sciences and humanities, the physical sciences and engineering, and the health sciences. And we do that through what I think is called Pathways to Improving Health and Well-Being. And this is a couple of documents that we had put together in the past. It's about leading a good lifestyle. I mean, let's make it simple. It's about eating well, it's about diet and exercise, it's about creating environments that start with preconception of women, not of women, of the offspring of women, and looking at pregnancy and that whole life course, and looking at what's at stake here. How, the inheritance theory is that, once we thought that it was just going to involve the fetus, well, it turns out there's cells within this fetus that could actually be writing risk into the third generation. And if you're looking at factors associated with how genetics is improving the diagnostic potential, you don't have to look further than breast cancer in women and show that there's certain triggers, too much sunlight, too much tobacco in this case, showing that you can actually have DNA in certain at-risk populations with different markers of polymorphisms can be more susceptible than others. And that gives you some information about how to alter your environmental circumstances. Again, this is a project from CIHR. It's a 15-year project that we're just initiating with support from Developmental Origin Physiology. And we're looking at optimizing development and care among First Nations across the country. It's a project that is about $15 million over 10 years. And we're looking at enrolling Native populations all across the country in this longitudinal cohort. Our group, when we put the application forward, there were 11 funded to develop grants, concept paper grants, where the community was the holder of the grant. In this case, again, it's the New Chownoth Tribal Council. And they're telling us under what conditions they would agree to having biological samples taken and tested, and having their kids enrolled in a study under their governance model. So I guess we can brag and say we were ranked #1 in the competition across the country, and we're really happy that we're kind of hopefully leading this different kind of study which promises to improve the health and well-being in the future. Speaking about the future, this young woman, 28 years old, Donna Mae Kimalarjuk, she's Inuk from Chesterfield Inlet, that's where her family's from. She's Canada's first cardiac surgeon who's employed full-time at the Ottawa Heart Institute, and a young woman who just won an Inspire Award. And she gave a talk up at UBC when we hosted a Heart and Stroke Foundation Listening for Direction conference a few months ago. And just her story was so inspiring. You can imagine the impact it would have on young women. So as I get towards the end of the talk here, I just wanted to say this is a piece of artwork from Morso, who basically invented, this art form. And he was a person who was handed some paints while he was serving some prison time and became like a master. And he's passed away now. That image at the bottom is a human, like an adult person, so it shows you the scale of the art. And what he's saying here is this piece represents the shaman's worldview, showing this thriving and bountiful world where all the diverse elements are in perfect harmony and balance. And I think it's really important that we imagine healthy Indigenous communities where, attachment, maternal attachment is a right, and that, people are given the best opportunity for optimal health and well-being throughout their life course. So I'm going to stop there. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope it was making some kind of sense.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Jeff referred to the film Fantastic Voyage, and I think we've been on a fantastic voyage of discovery over the last hour or so with Jeff, looking at everything from the ideology of cartography, maps, right through to the normative nature of science, through to health, and a real exposure of how health can be looked at through different lenses and serve different interests. And the work that Jeff is doing and others he's referred to try to ensure that as health research and activity proceeds, it tilts more in favor of understanding and supporting the needs of Indigenous populations. And I do have to mention as SFU president that Nadine Caron, who leads the Silent Genome Project that Jeff referred to, is an SFU graduate as well. Now we do have a few minutes for some questions, and then there will be a reception afterwards where we can have a less formal engagement with Jeff. I do need to tell you that this lecture and questions are being filmed for the SFU YouTube channel, so if you ask a question, that may mean that you end up on the YouTube channel. That is either an inducement or a barrier, but I hope it won't stand as a barrier for anyone who has a question. And we have a couple of people here, Heather and Anna, I think, who have microphones, because we need to have you on microphone in order for the people watching on the YouTube channel to hear your question. Jeff is mic'd, so he can answer from anywhere. And we'll open up the floor for any questions or comments you have that you'd like Jeff to respond to. I know it's a pretty thorough lecture, but there must be a few ideas. Here's one.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you for a terrific lecture. My question is, I understand this was a content-rich presentation, and my question is about the meaning of your choice to leave out a slide about the Indian hospital system in Canada.
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that I thought about. I think you're right. I mean, we shouldn't be talking about residential schools without talking about Indian hospitals at the same time. And I apologize. I think I was really constrained by time, but it's absolutely valid. That is another lecture all by itself, and I think, yeah, I totally agree with you.
It's hard to believe Jeff left anything out, but it's good to know that if he did, people in the audience are picking it up.
Yeah.
Is there any other comment or question that someone has before we take a break and have a reception? Yeah, down here in front. Heather, right here in front.
Yes, have you thought of giving people something to do to improve their health? I told you my niece's husband worked as a nurse, has just quit for many years in northern Manitoba. He was mostly the doctor too. They don't have doctors for First Nations people. And I mean, we have experienced relatives when in 1962 taught in northern Manitoba, and they had to, the lady had to wash the children's heads with coal oil, and they paid the children a nickel to come to school. If they didn't give them the nickel, they didn't come to school. Now, I had a friend who taught Inuit much later, some years ago in northern Quebec, where they had non-alcohol communities. And those children came to school lovingly and learned and were tremendous students. But many ended up committing suicide, just like the Indians, because they didn't have a future.
Yeah. Well, you know, I tried to show in different kind of terms that circumstances like social environments predispose anyone to problems, and that could be prevented. And I would argue that the circumstances in those communities were created by design by our government to make conditions intolerable that would force assimilation as the logical choice. And, you know, if that had worked, there wouldn't be any Native people in Canada, but it was a colossal failure. And we're in a situation right now where we're working very hard to reconcile that failure. And it's not something that Native people ever wanted. It was something that was imposed on them for the good of the nation state, quote unquote. So, you know, yeah. Yeah, so there have been terrible circumstances. They're well documented in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings, in the Royal Commission. And I guess it's a really good question because as Canadians, how long are we going to tolerate what's going on in our own backyard before we do anything about it? And so there's a lot of people, allies and Aboriginal people, that are working hard to bring about change. And, you know, I'm encouraged by it, but we got a long way to go. A huge struggle. But thanks for the question.
I'll invite one more person if anyone else has a question or comment. Yeah, one back here, and then we'll take a break for a reception.
Thanks, very nice talk. I'm just wondering if you have any advice for researchers who might want to engage with a community. What steps should they take?
Okay, that's a great question, and I did not plant that one, or that one. But one of the other things I've done until recently was chair the CIHR peer review panel on research. And what we initiated in that panel was something called iterative review and conditional funding. So what happens when a proposal comes forward, it gets ranked on community relevance and scientific merit, and it has to score on both. And what happens often is the scientific merit scores well, but the community relevance doesn't score as well. And we give bridge funding for a year to improve the community relevance. Now, sometimes the relevance is high, community relevance is high, and the sciences needs work. And again, we make those recommendations. And that's really useful because your typical CIHR grant, 1 in 10 gets funded type of thing. It's hard to go to a community who has an epidemic of suicide or other challenging circumstances and say, well, you know, we think it's important, but it didn't survive peer review. And this is a model now that allows a couple of things. It allows us to go back to community and say, okay, these are the things that's going to take the research from excellence to outstanding. And then they do meet, all the projects always, you know, respond. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3, you know, submissions before it gets to the point where the review panel is happy with the balance. But in the end, it's funded. We're funding about 9 out of 10 projects that way. And we're starting to meet needs in community. And the other thing, it provides an entry point for allies, for non-native researchers to partner with communities and then to jointly go forward and co-sponsor in partnership research projects. So I'm open for business. I'm around. I've got a few email addresses and I'm easy to get a hold of. So if you have any questions, we can go for coffee anytime.
Well, let me just say in appreciation that I love the faculty lectures because they not only allow us to share with you some of the amazing researchers we have at SFU, but invariably the researchers exemplify what we want to be as a university. And in our case, we call ourselves an engaged university because we want the value that we're producing within the university to be beneficial to society. And we want to be an instrument for reconciliation and demonstrate in our actions how we are helping to advance the reconciliation process. And I think you can see in Dr. Jeff Redding someone who exemplifies both of those values brought together. And why we're so proud and appreciative to have him with us as a researcher, and why I, on your behalf, want to thank him for just a fascinating lecture tonight. Thank you so very much.